And welcome to the 8:30 Live. This time more on time than the last two nights. And YouTube's just kicking in. Okay, YouTube. Hello and welcome to the 8:30 Live. I guess as the live notification goes out, I'll just start with some of the smaller pieces of news for the day. It is Sunday, so there's not that much that happened. Well, I guess that doesn't really mean much in the things can happen on a Sunday. It just so happens that not that much went down today, but a couple of big important things. But first, I'm just going to cover one of the small things that happened, which is just sort of amusing, which is you might be aware that the White House and every other American citizen. Now, it's not that you could just wander onto the White House grounds anyway because of the security considerations, but an entire fence was put up around the White House to prevent folks from getting anywhere near it, as protesters had tried to climb the what would you call it? It was the wrought iron fence, I guess, that existed around the property, and they wanted something a bit more. Well, because now you've got this chain link fence going all around, you can attach stuff to it. And so people have been posting protest art on the fence encompassing the White House. And it's really a sight to see, so I encourage you to go just look up some photos of it. It's quite nice. Hi, Simon. Good to see you, as always. So let's just get to the thing that everybody's talking about, which is that curfew is lifted. So this is pretty big, or it's big, it's small, what have you. It's definitely a thing. Curfew, this was supposed to be the last night of curfew here in New York City. Curfew was set to expire when it was announced. Well, actually, the first night of curfew, there was no plan. But the day after the first night of curfew, it was said that we would have curfew from 8 p.m. until 5 a.m. until the morning of June 8th. So this would have been June 7th, the last night of curfew. But instead, the mayor lifted it. And in reality, curfew was effectively lifted last night. People were told who went out to protest at 8:30 that there actually wouldn't be any enforcement of the curfew until 11. And in fact, there wasn't any real enforcement after 11 anyway. Today, the mayor came out saying that last night we had seen the very best of New Yorkers, which is to say no violence, no riots, no what have you. And as a result, he's lifting the curfew today. Now, I think we should try and be pretty clear about this, because the best of New Yorkers on display last night weren't the protesters. The protesters have been peaceful and nonviolent for pretty much the majority of these. There were like 2 nights when things were kind of crazy and people were getting their bearings about outside agitators. And then protesters themselves started to police the protests without outside help pretty effectively. You didn't see fires, you didn't see looting, you didn't see any of that stuff. Basically after the second or third night. It was the police who were on particularly bad display for the last 4 or 5 days. And it was the police last night who unexpectedly showed us their best colors by not doing anything aggravating or violent or brutal. And in response, the crowds didn't go crazy either. So we lifted curfew, but as far as I'm concerned, the best of New York that Bill de Blasio is talking about is the unexpected restraint of the NYPD doing nothing violent, which allowed us to demonstrate that demonstrators are peaceful. And now curfew has been lifted. In addition to this, because of all of the protests that have been going on, Bill de Blasio has heard the call and has agreed for the first time in his entire tenure to reduce the funding of the NYPD and send that money to other programs. So the one that's called out is youth groups to help basically engage young people and keep them off the streets and what have you. Good stuff. But basically youth programs and, in theory, other programs that provide not law enforcement services, but I guess you'd say community support and crime mitigation services. So these can take lots of different forms. Again, one of them is youth groups, which keep young folks off the streets and help them with after-school activities, job programs, other things that you might consider are things that help folks find jobs or retrain or work-related things like that, or assistance with housing and what have you, mental health. Those are the sorts of programs that people want money shifted from the NYPD to support. And we've finally seen some acknowledgement from the mayor that that is what people are calling for, and that is what he's going to do. So that's pretty great. I have not seen anything that says anything about how much of a shift to expect or which youth groups and programs will be receiving that money, but hopefully that will be coming in the next couple of days, which actually reminds me to mention that tomorrow, stay tuned, the legislature and the governor are meant to be dropping their gigantic raft of reforms for police at the state level. Again, that's tomorrow. And we spoke about what they were talking. We spoke about what they had hinted at, what the governor had hinted at yesterday. And we went through the 4 points of their program. We sort of broke them down and talked about how much we might expect from each of these things. And I guess just to recap them briefly, you've got making false 911 calls that have to do with race, religion, or other protected classes classified as a hate crime. You have barring and making illegal all chokeholds. You have the appointment of the Attorney General as the person responsible for investigating police misconduct. And then now I can't remember the fourth one. The fourth one is bollocks. This is why I have this book, so that I can go back on my notes. And now I can't remember what they are. Oh, yes. Say their name legislation, which is maybe a reform at 50A. Very unclear what say their name legislation is going to be. So we'll see what happens with state reform tomorrow. Now, the other really big news that everybody is talking about is that Minneapolis has decided to disband its police force. That's right. They've secured a veto-proof majority in their city council to disband the Minneapolis police force. So what does this mean? Well, I've been going back with folks on Twitter, and there are lots of police abolitionists out there who, you know, I proposed an idea for making the police less terrible. I thought it was a really good idea. A lot of folks agreed. And then there was a small fraction of folks who said, just eliminate the police entirely, abolish the police. Now, I've been reading up on this, and I'm not 100% sure whether all police abolitionists would agree with this, but from what I can tell, abolish the police, and this is based on a Twitter thread, which was posted and got some play, isn't really get rid of all the police. It is reduce the use of the police to solve society's problems, which makes me think that abolish the police is like the worst possible branding and messaging that you could use to promote your platform. Because unless you're saying that abolishing slavery is okay, is like successful because now we can only enslave people in prisons, abolishment doesn't really mean reform. And what they're calling for is reform and not using the police department to tackle specific societal ills where it's not useful to criminalize activity, which I agree with, which I think a lot of people would agree with. But if you're going to label that abolishing police, I don't think you're going to get very far, because when you say abolish something, abolishment for most people is a matter of kind and not degree. We're not going to slightly abolish something. We don't want to slightly abolish slavery. If I came to you and said, let's abolish ice cream, you wouldn't immediately assume that my intention was, let's only have ice cream at dessert and no longer have ice cream for snacks throughout the day. Abolishing ice cream would sort of imply, let's get rid of it altogether. I think that this sort of messaging is intensely confusing for people who aren't steeped in left literature. And as a result, I worry about how well that's going to play in elections and actually getting policies changed. But that being said, let's talk a little bit about what Minneapolis can actually do in disbanding its police force. And for this, let's look at Camden, New Jersey, which has been recently held up as a model. The one last thing I want to say about abolishing the police, people have been on the abolish ICE train for a long time as well. And getting rid of an entire police force is potentially a very meaningful thing to do. But I really want to remind folks that when we talk about abolishing things and starting from scratch and all these other things, one of the best examples of this actually is ICE. And ICE is terrible. You might remember this thing called the INS, the Immigration and Naturalization Service. Well, the INS was deemed to be so terrible and so brutal and so unfair and so awful that it had to be scrapped and rebuilt from scratch. Exactly what Minneapolis wants to do, exactly what a lot of folks are calling to happen to our police departments. Well, Congress did that. They destroyed the INS, and in its place, they built ICE. ICE is now the subject of intense pressure to abolish that as well, because it is so awful. So systemic change doesn't come from abolishing one thing and then creating another thing without dealing with the systemic issues for why the original one was terrible. Swapping names doesn't solve a problem. Saying that you abolish something only to recreate it in another form with minor changes doesn't necessarily fix anything. You need to talk about the systemic reasons that a process or a system doesn't work, what the roots of those causes are, and what can be done to resolve those things. And again, now let's have a quick look at Camden, New Jersey. Camden, for the late 90s and the early part of the 2000s, went from being a pretty dangerous city to being basically the violent crime and murder capital, homicide capital of the United States. In 2012, they peaked with 64 homicides in the city, which is a ridiculously high percentage for the population, but I can't quite remember what it is. By 2019, they had cut their homicide rate by 63%. And in the midst of all of this, they radically changed their policing tactics and did disband the Camden Police Force. But I want to talk about why they disbanded the Camden Police Force, what it was replaced with, and then how they changed their policing. In order to deal with their incredibly high violent crime rate, the city of Camden actually wanted to increase its police force. However, it didn't have the money to add officers. So instead, it made a deal with its county, and it disbanded the Camden City Police so that the county law enforcement could operate as Camden City's law enforcement as well. This actually doubled the police force. So in abolishing the Camden City Police, they doubled their police force overnight. What this led to was a much higher engagement on a daily basis of Camden residents with the police. And this is the important part. Instead of that doubling of interactions being one about criminality, Camden, and I guess the county, undertook the effort to make these trust-building exercises. Seeing more police but not having them be there to arrest you changed the perspective that Camden City residents had towards the police. It built trust between law enforcement and community residents, and it paved the way for a hand-in-hand partnership to improve the safety of the city. One of the other major reforms, though, that absolutely must be looked at is Camden City implemented an 18-page use of force policy. Amongst these reforms in this 18-page policy are 6 core principles. 2 of these core principles really stand out. One is that the use of force is a last resort. It is a last resort. And 2, and this is a core principle, if you see a fellow officer violating the other core principles or violating the 18-page 18-page policy on use of force, you are required to report it. Now, this is really important. These aren't suggestions, and these aren't vague. Most police departments have very vague use of force policies that say something along the lines of use of force when necessary. This was incredibly detailed. It made use of force a last resort, and it required police officers to stop other police officers from using use of force when it wasn't necessary or valid, lest they all be fired. And that was the last piece, which was that any use of force was immediate grounds for firing. If you operated outside the policy, these weren't optional, these weren't recommendations. If you operated outside the policy, you were liable to be fired. And so this suggestion was made to somebody, to me on Twitter, to look into Camden. And this was one of the folks who was, an abolitionist, abolish the police, I should say. Abolition is a different criminal justice concept, which goes to the elimination of all jails. Totally something else, which we could discuss at another time. But that's sort of, Camden, New Jersey presents us with a very, very drastically, crime decreased drastically. In Camden, the police officers marched with the Black Lives Matter protesters, and they didn't have riots, they didn't have looting. It was all very peaceful. And Barack Obama actually held up Camden, New Jersey as a model when he was president for how to do policing. So there are some lessons for sure that we can learn there. And actually, let me plug right now, I started watching 13th yesterday on Netflix, which is a documentary about the interplay of criminal justice and the criminal justice school to prison pipeline and all these other things on Netflix. Interplay of criminal justice and race, really, going all the way back to slavery and how Jim Crow was effectuated and all these other things. And I think for sure, if you already have a pretty liberal mindset, it will appeal to you. I definitely think that conservatives will look at it and be like, this is a load of bunk. But if you already have a background and you have some of the information on which it's based in your head already, it's going to add a lot to that. It skips out on some of the more foundational concepts, unfortunately. And that is why I think if you just gave it to a conservative, they'd be like, this is all propaganda. Because it's not so clearly elucidated how you get from one thing to the next. They try to draw a narrative, but in that narrative, the actual stepping stones are sort of left off, and that's the one problem with it. But it's certainly added to my knowledge base of how the interplay of race and criminal justice came about in the United States. Okay, so we've got one more thing to talk about, which is Nevada doing something big. But let's see the comments and see if anybody chimed in. The camera is a little fuzzy, says Simon Sachs. Huh. I'm sorry to hear that. Is it better now? It might be because I have low light. I've realized, actually looking back at the earlier videos from like 2 nights ago, that it's darker, which makes my camera work harder. And it's because one of my light bulbs is out and I didn't realize it. James Morris King, hashtag abolish the police is why you don't let the sun-baked Twitter socialists design your social outreach campaign to appeal to Joe Q. Public. James continues, worthwhile listen on the subject of American policing. NPR article. Thank you very much, James. So the last thing I wanted to chat about tonight, and Sundays are usually a relatively quiet night on the live, so that's, I tend to get my dinner in on time on these nights. The last thing I wanted to talk about is Nevada, because speaking of criminal justice and race, this is actually a pretty big move, and it's something that conservatives can oftentimes lose their minds over. So Nevada just allowed 77,000 ex-felons to vote in the 2020 election. So it just re-enfranchised 77,000 ex-felons. Now, there are a lot of folks who argue that once you've served your time, you should be able to vote. And there are a lot of folks who say, once you served your time, screw you, you still get stripped of your voting rights. There are many states where states work very hard to make it difficult for ex-felons to vote and keep them off the voting rolls. Now, from my perspective, if you're a citizen of the United States of America, you have the right to vote. There are lots of folks who argue that even if you are in prison serving your time, that you should have the right to vote. But I think it should be clear to all of us that once you have served your time, you should no longer have any rights stripped from you. You've done what it takes to recompense to society. And whether or not you think that the judge made a right decision, whether or not you think that the sentences are proportionate to the crimes that are committed, that's sort of irrelevant. These are things that need to be hashed out between you and the legislature and the other branches of government. But once you've served your time, there's no reason to strip somebody of any of their rights. But of course, it's used to disenfranchise entire communities. And one of the big things, if you watch 13th on Netflix, is that, and this is probably no secret to anybody who watches the 830 Live, but after the abolition of slavery, there was an exception carved out, which is to say, you can still be a slave if you're a criminal. And so criminalization of regular things that people do was used as a tool to round up former slaves and successive generation of black folk to effectively re-enslave them. Now, as folks in prison, obviously you're stripped of many rights, one of those being the right to vote in many, many cases. Once you get out, if you're not allowed to vote, then obviously in some regards, you're still enslaved. And this, because you have no input in your democratic government, right? And so this was used as a tool to keep black people from exercising the franchise, even though they had been given the right to vote and they had been given full citizenship. Now, yes, obviously, of course, more people than black people go to jail. But it is, I don't think, very difficult to make the argument that being black was effectively criminalized in much of this country. I would probably say all of this country, and still is in many ways. And so while the laws, as in general, theoretically apply to everybody equally, we all know that it's not really applied the same across constituencies. So this decision by Nevada to allow 77,000 ex-felons back onto the rolls, really, this is what we are striving for all across the country, because the racial disparity between folks who are deprived by being labeled criminals and those who do criminal things but simply get to walk the streets and continue to vote is one which completely bastardizes and skews our politics. And so as a result, I think this is fantastic news. And people have been, there was an article where Florida just had to re-enfranchise a bunch of ex-felons because of a court case. And people were like, there was a New York Times article that was like, well, it's unclear whether Democrats or Republicans benefit more from the re-enfranchisements of felons. And really, who gives a shit? Because this isn't about Democrat and Republican. This is about the fact that people who have served their time should have the right to vote. And it just so happens, particularly in the South, that the way that the law is applied has criminalized certain segments of the population more than others, regardless of the overall relative equality of criminality across constituencies. And so has deprived certain constituencies of their right to vote and participate in democracy at a much higher rate. But that's not really the important part. The important part is that you should not be enslaved after you leave. There's a real argument to be made that you shouldn't be enslaved even if you are in prison. But that's not what Nevada dealt with. And so I just wanted to bring that to folks' attention. In any event, that is everything I wanted to cover tonight. It's pretty chill night. It's a Sunday. Let's see if there's any more comments. Simon Sachs says yes, although I don't know to what thing he's referring. And then Julianne has a comment, which is, these are articles on police abolitionism. I briefly looked through them. It seems some people do want the complete elimination of both the police force and prisons. There is an abolition movement, which is for prisons, which is separate from the police. And that I've dealt with a fair amount because we just approved the building of 5 new jails in New York City. This, by the way, would be an opportune time to maybe reduce the size of those jails, because those jails are obviously anticipating, they're known as like mega jails, and they are anticipating a relatively large prison population, which maybe now we can begin to talk about how we shouldn't solve society's problems with prison. But that being said, I've had some debates and experiences with the prison abolition movement. It seems some people do want the complete elimination of both the police force and prisons. I think we can greatly reduce the prison population, but it is not completely possible. And there are some articles, and check them out. I would sort of agree. There's always going to be folks who are violent or need to be kept away from others for everyone's safety, which is also why you can't completely eliminate the police. Although if you really think about it, why are people violent? There's really only two reasons. They need to be violent, as in they need to steal something to survive, or there's something psychological that's deep-rooted there that makes them violent, right? There's only really, ultimately only two things that drive humans. One is just intense internal emotional construction, and then the other is external factors forced upon you. So if we devote our money towards making a society that takes care of its citizens and residents, that provides them with food and housing, and doesn't put them in a position where they need to commit violent acts to survive, then you're left with people who are violent because they're incapable of controlling their impulses or other reasons. And then the argument would be, for those folks, they need mental health. That effectively punishment, that retribution doesn't actually solve the problem at all. So that if the reason for jail is punitive, you can't correct the reasons that people commit crimes. So if you are committing an economic crime, a crime of economics, I should say, one that's put upon you by your station, by your situation, punishing you doesn't solve your problem. And so when you go back to that problem, you might try harder, I suppose, to find a way to solve your problem without committing a crime or being violent, but that might just be impossible. And you're put in a hard situation either way. If somebody who's incapable because of their mental state is put in jail and they're not given the mental health treatment that they need, then the punishment doesn't help them either. Now, you might say that in some cases you have the negative reinforcement. And so for some people, for some fraction of people, maybe the punishment of going to jail actually clicks in their mind and they decide that they would prefer not to have punishment, so they stop doing the thing. This is commonly, how people characterize sociopaths. Sociopaths are people who they do terrible things and they don't care about other folks, but they can be very successful because from their perspective, punishment is something to be avoided. And so they learn quickly to avoid punishment, but still do terrible things to other human beings. So in some regards, in some cases, that negative reinforcement might do it. But in many, many cases, I'd say the majority of cases, because now we're talking about a segment of, and then for a much, maybe tiny sliver of the population that really is just violent and needs to be kept away from folks because there's nothing that we know that can treat them or help them, then you have jails. And so while I also would agree that it is functionally almost impossible to get rid of jails, exactly how little jail you can get away with is the subject of debate. And abolitionists would argue that you really shouldn't have any jails whatsoever, maybe 10 rooms for people who really can't function in society. But for the most part, we need to be providing mental health facilities and maybe involuntarily committing people, but it would be different from jail, which is seen as and treated as a punitive measure where we are there to deprive people of the comforts of life because they did something wrong, and we want to punish them for having done something wrong. This is actually addressed somewhat. I haven't finished 13th. but it's addressed somewhat in the idea of mandatory sentencing and mandatory minimums, where judges they had their capacity to sentence and prescribe punishment based on context taken away from them by legislatures. And, a lot of that fed the problems that we see, which is that you had people going away for jail to be punished for a long time, even though their crime might have been a relatively small infraction. Well, I won't go into it. You should check out 13th or look into that. But, that is, a serious debate to be had. And the abolitionist movement, while it may sound far-fetched, has some legs to stand on in terms of the policy argument. And so these are things that require a lot of thought, and they both have to be, you have to level it. You have to square it both with the ideals that we want to purport and the optimism that people can be helped, but of course as well the pragmatic side of it can be almost impossible to help everybody. And so the need for police and the need for jails is not something that we're likely to do away with, even in a majority sense. Like, we're probably going to need much of the infrastructure that we have for some time reformed for sure, but even as it exists now, there are lots of folks who think, have thought much more on this than I. But there are these tensions, and certainly I believe that certainly the police and the jail system can and should be both deeply reformed and deeply reduced, and other programs should be expanded substantially. But exactly how far you can go down that road, I think, is a very difficult question. But it's something that we should be calling on our leaders to look at. Again, we'll see what Albany has to say tomorrow. And with that, I will also say that I'll see you tomorrow at 8:30, and we can talk about what happened in the New York State legislature. All right, I'll see you. Oh, no, I forgot that there's comments. Okay, more comments. Let's read them. Julianne says, according to these articles, prison abolitionism and police abolitionism are not separate issues, but very closely connected. You can't have one without the other. Well, I mean, if you had police abolitionism, you would not arrest people and there would be no jails. If you had jail abolitionism, you could still have police. They just wouldn't be able to put people in jails. So they are tightly connected, but I do think you can have one without the other. You can have police without jails because you can decide that the way to deal with people that the police apprehend is not punitive, it's rehabilitative, but you can't really have jails without police because who will put people in those jails? Dan Chilton says rehabilitation, and yes, I absolutely agree that the goal of criminal justice is rehabilitate. God damn it! The goal of criminal justice is rehabilitation and reconciliation, not punishment. Of course, the urge for vengeance is strong in humans, and people want to see, quote, justice done, but real justice is contextual. Real justice has to do with the difficulties that everybody faces in a given situation. Real justice is about making amends, not hurting somebody as much as they hurt you. Julian Valentin, I think both the external and internal factors work together. You can do a lot with social change, but there are people who will always commit crimes. And crimes aren't always violent. Insider trading, for instance, we can provide many social services, but people do make choices. Yes, and people who commit insider trading should probably go to jail. Nope, that's punitive for me. You have to look at why they're doing these things. And if the answer is, of course, because I want more, that's not a good answer. And again, for some segment of the population, negative reinforcement might be a useful tool. So for insider traders, for example, who have a lot, this is a crime because of their internal calculus that the payoff is less than the cost. So you must increase the cost. Well, I don't want to say that definitively, but that's my analysis of it in the moment. Julian Ballington, I know many people who would benefit from therapy but refuse to go. People make choices at the end of the day, and all we can do is provide the options. Well, I mean, the point of abolishing prisons is that you no longer have the choice to go to therapy. Like the government, as part of the law enforcement, makes you do these things. So you don't have. It's not that the police pick you up and they're like, "Well, you've got a problem, so we want you to go to therapy. Please, consider that." You are forced to do things because you messed up. It's just not done punitively. And the solution to your problem isn't to throw you in a box. The solution to your problem is tailored to the cause of your problem. Simon Sachs says, "Thanks, Ben." You're welcome, Simon. I don't know for what. If it's just for doing the live, it's my pleasure. And otherwise, thank you for tuning in. And thank everybody else for joining as well. That's it. I guess that's all the comments. We covered the stuff. Let's call it a night. Another peaceful Sunday. All right. I'll see you all tomorrow at 8:30.